Ready?
Good evening. My name's Matthew McLaughlin,
And I'm Daniel Sandner.
and we have some notes for.
Apollo 13.
Yes, indeed.
This is going to be a hard one.
Oh my goodness.
To have any notes for.
And on that topic, this is going to be one of the movies where I give it one of the highest honors a viewer possibly can. And I'm going to say before any spoilers happen, go watch this. This is one of the movies that I really wish I could watch for the first time. And with that out of the way, let's jump into it.
I was going to say, if there's spoilers, you have, this came out in 95, guys, or 94 or something. So
Yeah, seriously.
watch the movie.
Seriously, watch this one. The experience of seeing this for the first time, especially as somebody who really didn't know the story, it was absolutely shocking, especially the fact that it is true.
Mm-hmm.
It's as close to a documentary as a film can be without being a documentary.
For the most part.
Yeah, there's obviously some embellishments, whatever, but yeah, it is an incredible story. I mean, the fact that that they freaking survived alone, that's a miracle in and of itself. But let's dive into the movie. I want to start with the beginning.
Okay. Very
Good.
good place to start.
I think it's a great place to start. The fact that they didn't jump straight into their mission, I think, served this movie so well. Jumping into it and basically telling the story about how they were watching. No Apollo mission knew who would be the first to set foot on the moon. So you see it through the eyes of these main characters that we're going to be having, and they see Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong touch down on the moon and land. And you see the proudness in Tom Hanks' eyes, and you also see his disappointment, knowing that he wasn't the first, but that it was possible. And showing the human side about the motivations and what they wanted, and the family aspects, and everything that goes into the human side of this. Oh, so masterfully done. It really made me feel like I was right there watching it in the moment.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's going to be, like I said, it's going to be hard to knock anything about this one because it falls into that criterion of, I wouldn't say like perfect movies, but it's in that era of 90s, late 80s through the 90s to the early 2000s era of just excellent movies where, even things like Terminator 2 fall into, Jurassic Park fall into, where it's the movies that made our childhood. And so in that way, it's really hard to come at this with any sort of critical eye, and only an eye of utter appreciation for just the fact that this is what sculpted our appreciation for movies. This is, at least it was for me, was what I watched as a kid that inspired me in so many ways to love movies and these compelling stories. I mean, this movie is a pivotal one for me as someone who's always loved space travel and has always loved the NASA missions. Having something that was taken directly from the experiences of Jim Lovell and his book and translated to the screen, at least from what I've heard, almost completely. Like you had mentioned somewhat of embellishments, but to my knowledge, outside of maybe them fighting in the LEM, that maybe didn't happen. To my knowledge, this was as true to life as it came, to the point where I've heard a lot of people say it should have been a documentary because it was so accurate. And I think Jim Lovell, I don't think he was wrote any of the screenplay, but I know he was on set and that there was consultation with, past astronauts and that there were mission control people talking in the ears of the mission control actors in here. Yeah. And so as far as I'm aware, and that's kind of why I have such an appreciation for this movie, it's about as accurate as it gets telling this story, which is so rare. We've had a lot of movies come after it that are similar, like First Man with Ryan Gosling is an example of a movie I really didn't like because it was embellished and felt wrong. The Martian is a good one. It's obviously a different planet, different circumstance, that you could tell wouldn't have succeeded without Apollo 13. That Apollo 13 really did it right and was the first one to do it, which is so cool.
Dang. So it's like it broke ground in the best way possible.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. They did their research and they did it right and told the story accurately. And it was a story, that we didn't know, having not grown up in the 60s necessarily, that we've sort of like the Challenger. It wasn't something that was necessarily in our timeline. And so watching a movie like this, we just expected to be overly embellished.
Oh, yeah.
And yet knowing that it's ultimately kind of not, that this was a tense story, that this was a difficult moment in NASA's history, and the irony of the 13s across the board here makes it so much better. It makes you think that it's just movie nonsense, and yet it follows the path, and it's so fascinating that it does.
Yeah.
So even more to what you were saying, the fact that they're able to build in those character beats to not only just tell the story of the incident, but to bring the heart and soul to those characters and what they were likely thinking is even better.
Yeah, and there were how many characters in this movie?
Quite a few. They
Yeah.
juggle a lot of characters.
They were able to give stories to every single character.
Just enough.
Just enough.
Mhm.
The fact that even the guy who was in charge of figuring out how many amps they needed to have, the guy with the best comb owner, the steely-eyed missile man, who was able to
Yeah.
have his team come up with the who was able to come up with the square peg in a round hole. Like, we understood him. We didn't need to get a bunch, so it's not like it overwent or blew over anything. They got
Mhm.
exactly what we needed to know about him,
Mhm.
nothing more, and he served his role perfectly.
Mhm.
The fact Ron Howard was able to direct everybody to have that is mind blowing, just from a film perspective.
Absolutely. It just goes to show how something like a situation of a spacecraft having issues can hone in the story to exactly where it needs to be. To be like, well, you've set up these characters, like you said, they're watching the Apollo 11 mission and them touching down on the moon for the first time, the inspiration into it. And right from there, I mean, even though everything before the incident in this movie, it's slow-ish. It's definitely,
Yeah.
it feels very different from the rest of the movie. It's its own thing for sure. It's hyper focused. I mean, you go from him not even commanding the module to learning that he's now commanding the module to the problem with what's his face getting the measles and just the changeover in crew and all of that, just perfectly setting up every instance that's going to happen ahead. There's no extra fat to be trimmed. It's just done well.
It so is. Now, I want to ask you a question.
Okay.
Who's the main character in your opinion?
In this one,
Mm-hmm.
who is the main character? I mean, as much as I want to say it's not, it kind of has to be Tom Hanks to me. I mean, he's the one who narrates it out at the end too. So, I don't know. Did you have a different main character?
Yeah, I think that while he is, narratively and screen time wise the main character, man, did I relate to the head honcho down on the ground at NASA, Mr. Vest
So
Man.
Ed Harris's
Yes.
character, so mission control leader.
I'm not going to fully argue because obviously Tom Hanks is the main character. It's a pointed question on purpose. But, oh man, I think this is a story about one leader's determination to make something happen. At the end of the day, these are astronauts that were all in survival mode. And in survival mode, you have to keep your cool. You have to do all these things and be able to listen to your team on the ground. And if that team of hundreds of people is not able to be led in the correct direction, which there is only one correct direction, nothing's going to go right. And the fact that this one guy had all of this pressure on his shoulders and was able to come through in real life, I would argue that he might be the main character.
That's an interesting take.
Yeah.
That's an interesting take. I could see it. Totally could see it. I think at least in every time I've ever watched this movie, while, we all love America's Dad, Tom Hanks. And as much as I love, Kevin Bacon, he's not so lovable in this movie, but between him and Bill Paxton and everything too, I just love Gary Sinise in this movie. I love his arc the most because not only I have kind of a soft spot in my heart for him as a person because I've never met him, but when I worked at Disney, I got to be like 10 feet away from him at one point during a choir thing there. And he is just a man that exudes like this like quiet humility and confidence. And I love that subdued maturity that kind of comes through his entire role where he's, screwed over royally in this kind of
Seriously.
thing. And, completely benched by the medical director. But I always admire the fact that, he is there not only as a team player, but he's there for his friends. He's there for the people that, during the beginning of the movie, Tom Hanks says that they can predict each other's, next sentence and what they're doing and their inflection in their voice. And he knows that at that moment that he's the one who can get him out of there. And so I love that, the whole first half of the movie, he's non-existent, except the beginning. But he comes back in as like the most pivotal character at the end, that they put him on the console to communicate with his buddies. And so I wouldn't say that he becomes a main character. I mean, he comes more to the front, but I certainly admire him. I think to the extent that you're speaking with Ed Harris's character, where it's such an admirable thing, and you see more growth in those characters than you possibly do in the ones in the three guys up in the spacecraft.
Yeah.
Sure.
I would say that this movie does something very interesting, which is it shows respect much more forwardly than I can picture in other movies. The respect that is derived, the very natural anger that all of these astronauts felt in the build up to the launch, Tom Hanks realizing that he might not be able to walk on the moon because he's going to lose his pilot.
Right.
Right. And that he has to make a terrible decision, and that pilot has to hear the news from him, and Tom Hanks has to be, upfront with him that it was his call that made that happen. And the disappointment and the frustration, the fact that nobody really liked Jack all that much. You could tell it was very business.
Yeah.
You're in that chair because you have to be. We just have to trust that you did everything right, but we don't know you to the extent that we knew the other guy.
Right.
And the fact that they're all able to come back in the end and be there for each other and show that legitimate respect. I can't really think of another movie that demonstrates respect so well.
Exactly. I think that just speaks to the professionalism that it takes to be in a program like that. It shows that they're all professionals in their own way to deal with high pressure situations. And it's that, scene in the middle or, third act of the movie where things are starting to climax and they start screaming at each other. And Tom Hanks said, you can scream all you want, bounce off the wall for 10 minutes, but we're all going to come right back here. And so you have to. There's no other way around it. And I agree. I think that that's one thing that really does distinguish this one from a lot of other movies like this is you don't have characters that just explode off the wall. That everyone is so goal driven. And I think that's what drives the tension in this movie so well is that there's never moments where you can blow out. You have to keep that tunnel vision forward. And I think between characters like Ed Harris, between the three astronauts, and heck, even just the cutaways to the characters who are spiraling a little bit, like the wives and such, it's just such a great, especially I'll call it the second half, although it's like not the first quarter of the movie, but the last three,
post-explosion.
That's just driving along. Yeah. And so it's tense the whole time and you're feeling isolated. You're feeling behind what they're feeling, which is perfect.
Yeah. The tension is so palpable. I wouldn't mind talking a little bit about the lack of the blowout because in modern movies, my God, has that become something that is just like expected and at least to me annoying in modern movies.
Acting is considered just being loud.
Yes, that's all it is.
You did this.
Yeah, and then there's going to be the dramatic one where the camera's above them and they have to look up and scream to the sky because something's horrible.
Right.
That is non-existent. The closest we get is Jack Swigert finding out that he's good. He's ready to fly.
He screams. Yeah.
He screams in joy and enthusiasm.
Exactly.
That's the closest that we get to modern Hollywood's trope of
Well, and it does in this one. It does the exact opposite. I mean, you're watching Ed, not Ed Harris, not Kevin Bacon, not Tom Hanks. What was his character's name? Jacko, something.
Jim something.
No.
Was he in Apollo 11?
He was in the capsule.
Yeah, it was.
They called him like Jacko or. I'm so bad.
Wasn't it Jim?
No, Jim was Tom Hanks' character.
That is Tom Hanks' character. It was Jeff, wasn't it?
I don't remember. But
some J.
It was his character, whose name I can't remember right now, who was in Twister, who was sick, and showing his progression through all of that. I marveled at that more this time than I did before. Was just him showing his illness and having to persevere through that. You saw a lot of inner decisions and inner turmoils in a lot of these characters that didn't need them to shout their emotions to the world. It just goes to show how much of an all-star cast this was, and that they were able to bring the same emotional damage to the situation as screaming to the sky. It's screaming to the stars. That their acting was so calculated and so expression based or so action based.
Yes,
which is really cool. It didn't need that, and so they're able to maintain the tension and the professionalism that comes with being an astronaut. All of that. which is amazing.
Yeah. I'm talking about his getting sickness. That was a good example of not having to do something as well. He had a lot of moments where he would either not move very much because he was getting cold, or that he wouldn't say something because his sickness was getting to a particular point where he just couldn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
And the absence of saying things, the absence of screaming to the world, showed strength.
Mm-hmm.
And also really gave, a hint to how he was actually feeling. I mean, letting the audience actually pick up on something, I can tell you, made it feel much more impactful from sitting on the couch.
Much more personal too.
Yeah,
That you can relate to
seriously.
these characters a lot better because you're fighting for them. You're seeing those struggles, and you're seeing that they're having to well up their emotion to get the job done.
Mhm.
Which it's a great way to convey. Fredo.
Fredo. It was Fred.
Bill
Goodness
Paxton.
gracious.
Fredo. I just the names, man. These are classic actors. I just think at names. Well, so speaking about that a little bit, this, like I said, I'm a little biased because this falls in the category of those classic '90s movies that we hold in some sort of a, kind of a high esteem because they were kind of what we grew up with.
Oh, yeah.
And to that extent, I mean, this was not only a stacked cast. I mean, you have like the quintessential Ron Howard movie. You have the director of photography was the gentleman. He also did Back to the Future. He did Jurassic Park, whose name I can't remember right now. You have people who created this movie. You have actors in this movie. Like Tom Hanks was in his heyday at this point.
Yeah, no kidding.
Same with Bill Paxton. Same with Kevin Bacon. I mean, all of them. And so it's just an absolute home run at the end of the day that it's so hard because this movie inspired so many other movies after it. This was the way of impressive 90s movies at the time, where it put together fantastic practical effects in addition to the budding new CG effects, and so tastefully.
So tasteful. We'll talk
and
about the CG for
exactly,
sure.
we have to. Dean Cundy, that's the DP. But it just has this unique style, this unique gravity to it. No pun intended. Gravity to it. That I feel like we could spiral off and talk about this too. That movies nowadays don't really have. It has this groundedness where everything is working so well together to create this cohesive piece that we definitely strike gold every once in a while with movies nowadays.
Mhm.
But there are certain ones, especially from the 90s, that this one is the amalgamation of it all, where it's, amazing actors, amazing writing, phenomenal editing, great direction from the DP, effects, all of it, music. Oh my gosh, music.
Mhm.
It's so good.
It really
It's
is.
so good. Anyways, that's my soapbox, but it's so good.
It's a great soapbox.
It's hard to fault a movie like that, and I think we're gonna figure that out in this series. Where like Mufasa, we could, crap on all we want, but boy, Apollo 13. So I don't know. Did you have other things on what you like about it? Because I'm curious if there's anything on that same kind of train of thought that you could nitpick about it, that you have qualms with, or that you would change. Because I have a few, but they're few and far between.
Yeah, right now my mind is going on what you talked about how
Go for it, yeah.
this set the stage for modern and going after. When this movie come out?
It was either 94 or 95.
94, 95. So right in the mid 90s this came out, and it did kind of set the stage for what a realistic space movie can be. I mean, before this, what was there? There was the Star Wars franchise, Star Trek.
A lot of non-serious space movies. I mean, except for maybe like 2001: A Space Odyssey, where it was fantastical in nature, but done practically and somewhat seriously.
Yeah.
But even like this was on the heels of Star Trek, and so you can see massive influence of Star Trek in here, in part because their VFX director was the same one for Star Trek. But there's a lot of that. I mean, we were kind of also in the prime time for action adventure.
That's true.
And this was kind of the not first foray, but at least in the genre of space movie done seriously, inspired by events that didn't happen all that long ago in the grand scheme of this, where they're using actual testimonies from the astronauts that were there. And so this was like the golden time to make this kind of movie. And I think you could really see that swing of movies that followed after, where people wanted not necessarily grittier, but like more realistic, more accurately told historical dramas. And so following this, you'd see things like this was probably before, but like Saving Private Ryan is a good example.
Mhm.
You'd see some ones that Spielberg came off and did, out of this in a kind of a similar style, same kind of stacked cast, same kind of just really cohesive historical drama.
Yeah, it's one of those movies that really feels like everybody was invested so heavily.
It was
I
relevant.
mean, yeah, it was relevant. You just made me realize that this whole event actually took place in April of 1970.
Mhm.
We are, I think, officially further away from the movie release than the makers of the movie were from the event actually
If we're
happening.
95, then yeah, we're pretty darn close. Huh?
Yeah, we're right in that.
Which is crazy to think, because they were all pretty darn young even for this. So yeah.
Yeah, because we would be 30 years away, and if it was
Mhm.
1970 to 1995, that's
Mhm.
25 years, right?
5 years.
So we're further away to the launch of the movie than they were to the event
The
that,
actual
that
event.
they were documenting effectively.
I haven't thought of that. That's crazy.
Oh,
Yeah.
that is weird to think about.
That is
It
weird
makes
to think
sense
about.
why they were so invested. They
Mhm.
all lived through it. They all saw this happen.
Mhm.
They probably have memories of sitting at their TV or radio
Mm-hmm.
or whatever and watching this actually unfold.
And that's a fair point. I know that my dad can recall precisely where he was when astronauts walked on the moon. And it's really cool to hear the accounts of people who were in a kind of similar experience, granted not astronauts, but families of the feeling of walking on another planetary body is something that we hopefully maybe someday we'll get to see someone walk on Mars or something and get that same kind of feeling.
Right.
And we've had moments close to.
we
like
just
the
had those
rovers and things like that.
yeah, and we just had those announcements from the new presidency. We're not
Mhm.
going to get political, but there's just an announcement that we're going to be seriously trying to go for Mars as a
Mhm.
country.
Yeah, the Artemis program too. Even we're gonna try to get back on the moon within a couple years. So it's crazy to think that when this movie came out, that was also kind of the reason for the cultural relevance and why I grew up with it so much. Because if I think about who in my family kind of led me to this movie, my dad being a massive space buff and someone who has definitely inspired my thoughts about space, who wanted to be an astronaut himself. Grew up with this kind of mentality. And so when this movie was coming out, especially, I feel like it was invigorating. Plus, I don't remember the exact time when the space shuttle ended, but it would have been about, I think it was early
Somewhere
2000s. I think it was like 2003.
Somewhere in there, yeah. I
So
think
this
you're
would
right.
have still been in the height of Starlab or Skylab and the International Space Station and all of those missions.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, with a 25-year capped on this, the Apollo program ending, 10 years or something before that. I don't remember exactly when it ended. It ended with 18 or 17 or something, 17. So yeah, it's cool.
Yeah,
it's
it
cool.
is.
And it's cool that kind of in retrospect that it all still holds up today. That we can watch this movie and it's just as fresh, it's just as exciting, it's just as inspiring as it probably was for the people who watched it then, potentially having seen the original thing when they did.
Yeah,
And
literally
knowing the story.
the only thing that dates any of it is tech.
Mhm.
That's it. Tech and cars. That's the only thing
Right.
that dates
But
it.
because it's a period piece, we're stuck in the 70s, baby.
It so holds up. It so holds up. Everything about it was so good. The casting, the styling. What I mean, the styling, like the wardrobe that they
Mhm.
wore.
Yeah.
No makeup or hair was distracting. Nothing
Mhm.
like that. All the little details of. This movie also is such a roller coaster, but it's a roller coaster that never leaves about up here.
True. True. Once it gets going, true.
Yep, you're building. Oh crap, they're in trouble. And then okay, they fix the thing.
And then
Oh
by
shoot.
the very end, it's going 100 miles an hour. It pulls right into the station, and you're weeping.
and you're done. And
It's
you're like,
great. It's an amazing feeling as James Horner plays you out of the station.
Yes.
It's amazing.
when Vest guy, again I can't remember his name.
Ed Harris is.
Yeah.
I don't know his name either.
When
but
Ed's
Ed Harris's
character,
character.
when he finally like crashes down and he like
Mm.
has that
It's
relief.
over. It's
The amount that I felt from that is just insane.
Mhm.
I feel like I don't get that from any movies
the
recently.
the build up and the payoff are. This is a
Yes.
classic story of like, because we're following kind of a known story, following it accurately. It has the gravity that the real thing would have had. It has real stakes. It has real emotions and real characters.
Yes.
And because it has the benefit of Jim Lovell being the one who wrote the book and consulted on the movie and everything too, it has that level of accuracy. And so yeah, a lot of movies today are so slogged with so much fake. The stakes don't seem real.
Yeah.
And this is one of those ones where they seem real. And in part, we can talk again about VFX here later. It was a movie made where they couldn't have relied fully on CG. And so many things were real. And I know that a lot of this was filmed on like an actual, no, I'm not going to say period accurate, but like a recreation of Houston's site, and a lot of the internals of the spacecraft were complete replicas. I mean, heck, a lot of the Zero G was filmed. I think all of the Zero G was filmed on the Vomit Comet. Yeah, and so because they couldn't do wire paint outs, and so they just filmed it for real, and so it feels real.
Yes.
So cool.
The moments where they take their that moment, you could tell was absolutely a movie director wanting to show off a little bit, because we get no Zero G, no mention of Zero G for the entire thing, and then all of a sudden the astronauts leave orbit and they're like, pop it off, and it's floating.
And
nothing's saying, and it's just floating, and it's just such a great spectacle.
It's so great because nowadays we're like, we bat an eye. You see Zero G in TV shows now, which is crazy, and it's just a lot of wire work. But for them to have a 23-second window at the apex on the Vomit Comet to film that in a set in the Vomit Comet, like, dang.
And the Vomit Comet's a plane, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a big cargo plane that just does this. So yeah. So and there you're able to get the real Zero G recreation, but you only have, I think it's like 25 to 30 seconds of apex Zero G time before it has to go down and go back up.
Man, talk about credit to everybody on the team, because there's a lot of talk these days about the modern technology that goes into movies and how you can kind of spot it. I feel like I've seen a lot of talk recently about the volume. Big room filled with TVs, and it's using The Mandalorian and everything. That's its most famous one. And a lot of people have started to point out that you typically will only have characters walking to the edge of something and looking out over an expanse. And that's pretty telling of the volume. But with this, I mean, it's not like there were really short cuts or something. It all felt completely natural.
They used their situation not so much to their advantage, but they understood what their limitations were.
They really did, and they just used them.
They did.
They just so used them.
Well, and nowadays, like one of the biggest tells for fake Zero G is like hair replacement. You'll see a lot of You'll see a lot of like Captain Marvel's the one that comes to mind, although that's whatever. But a lot of it is, they'll put someone into a wire rig, they'll don them with a bald cap, and then they'll replace their hair in CG if they have hair floating around, to help sell that effect too, because you're doing all of this crazy wire work. We have paint out. In 95, they had paint out, I think, but it was early to paint out wires. And so you think about that from a production standpoint, like, awesome. Because I think this was actually the first movie to use the Zero G plane to film. I don't know if it was the last. I don't know.
I was going to say, are there any more
that
you can think of?
But I know it was the first, because it was a big
so
production question to figure out how to, put a cameraman in there to like move around. And so it gives it this not necessarily found footage, but like a documentary feel where the camera's trying to get out of the way of them coming through.
Yep.
They're passing, stuff through. And it's great.
We talk a bit on this podcast about the camera making sure that it feels like it's actually in the situation, that subconscious trigger never happens. And the only time that it happened for me in this whole movie was there was a shot pretty early in the movie after they take off, and I think they're hitting a booster just to start launching to do a burn. And the camera, it's on the side of the spaceship, and as they hit the booster, it goes right into the thruster. That was the only one that took me out.
That was a little weird. Okay.
That was the only one.
It's ironic that you mentioned cameras, because I noticed more camera shadows in this than I ever have before.
Oh, seriously?
In the not very beginning scene, but when Jim and his wife are out in the lawn and he's doing the thumb up at the moon, they're there looking down, and I was thinking, wow, that's a really harsh shadow from the moon. It's because it's looking down at them. They're in their chairs, and you just watch he's in focus, so the rest is fairly shallow. And you just watch this camera crane just like moving in the lawn behind it. That's kind of obscured by shadow, but totally obvious. Between that and what was the other scene? I think it was when they were in mission control for the first time and they were like introducing people and getting ready for flight. No. I take that back. It was his daughter they were scolding her on what to wear, and they're having the conversation of he's now going to go to the moon. And it was all done in a bedroom that you could tell was pretty tight bedroom. It wasn't an open set. And so they were getting so close to the camera, you could see the shadow of the camera on their
I
shoulders.
think I remember seeing that actually.
Yeah,
Yeah,
when
that
they
one
walk
rings
by.
a bell.
Yeah. So I noticed a lot of that, which kind of solidified for me as I was watching it, because I've seen it a ton of times. I was trying to find things that were a kind of a fault, that were things
Yeah.
that I were like, okay, I'll be a little more critical. And yeah, seriously, everything up until the moment of their launch is okay. Like, had the rest of the movie followed that trajectory, it sets up everything nicely.
Yes.
That's definitely not saying it doesn't do that. The pacing's definitely a little slow.
Mhm.
And it lacks a lot of that kind of finesse and intentionality I feel that the rest of the movie has, just in terms of its camera work.
Mhm.
I felt that it was shot a little more lazily, and
Do you think that had to do with the fact that they were trying to show how routine the public felt about this?
I don't know. It's outside of, some key shots that you could tell were like the storyboarding beats shots, like the thumb over the moon,
Yeah.
things like that. The big shots. Everything in between felt a little soap opera-y. I couldn't tell if it was
bit,
just
yeah.
the TV or whatever. It just felt sort of like that higher shutter speed soap opera feel, where it felt like I was watching a sitcom, just for parts. One, they started getting in the NASA facility and going through all that. It fixed up, but especially like that opening party and stuff like that. There's not a lot of music. There's not a lot of sound design.
Right.
And this thing, I think, won an Oscar for sound design. And the rest of the movie has tension. I mean, it has the kind of the snare drumming part in the background throughout. And so there is that building tension, and it's so different from the beginning of the movie that I could see that the people who probably don't like this movie as much because of, thinking it's boring, I suppose, maybe we're lost in that part where they're setting up characters. They're doing it in a very good job. You just don't know what the payoff is if you're a first-time watcher until it pays off, and then it's worth it, and it makes a lot of sense. But that was the one part that I noticed was a little different from the rest, that it felt drastically different. Had I had like side-by-sided it, felt like different movies a little bit.
It makes me wonder if sometimes if that's the tell of a really, really good production. Because I think, now this is TV, not movies, but Breaking Bad, a lot of people say you got to get through the first episode, first 2 episodes or whatever, and then it kicks off.
Right.
And it's because it's all character work. It is all motivations. It is all the pacing and the shots and everything. At least I know for sure with Breaking Bad. Don't know for sure with Apollo 11. But all of that was done to show the monotony he was feeling in his life. It was to show just how boring it was and how his life kind of sucked. He was supposed to be this great genius at a science lab, and that basically got taken away from him in his mind, and then it kicks off and he starts doing all the crazy stuff. So it makes me think that Ron Howard specifically did it like that. The camera shadows and stuff, yeah, that leads more as evidence to what you're saying, that it was probably just not as epically shot, but I kind of wonder. Don't know for sure, but it would be really interesting to know.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because we live in a day and age of the 3-hour movie, of the movie that takes 10 years to do anything. And
Yes.
TV shows more than ever. I mean, Breaking Bad was a good example of that, but think
Yes.
about many other shows that, get through the first season. Get through the first
Yeah,
2
if you have
seasons.
to get through the whole first season,
A few
something's
episodes,
wrong.
that's something, but your goal is to be immersed, not to be checking your watch. And so I think that that's another place where these 90s movies kind of fit into their own niche really well, is that even though, and that's literally the only gripe I have for this movie, is just the kind of the weirdness between the first section and the second section, the pre-flight and the flight, is just that kind of interesting feel of it, and the fact that it's so very different from the rest. Yeah, it could very well have been intentional, but even though it had that, it was still very intentional.
Yeah.
You look back at every scene, and outside of and I know why it was in there, outside of her dropping the ring down the drain, which is a weird interjection shot, which is true, by the way.
She
which
did?
Is why she did do
Oh
that.
my gosh.
So that was one thing I remembered reading was people were like, yeah, why was that in there? That felt cheesy. That felt like this weird, corny play at drama, to be like, we're going to add a little extra drama by putting their marriage in jeopardy. Like,
Now, before you-
dropping the ring
yeah.
makes you feel like that.
And before you continue, I'll just say that I totally was in the moment with that.
Were
So,
you?
yeah, I just want to say that.
Okay. No, that's okay.
Continue
That's
with what
okay.
you were saying, because I'm so interested to see what you're going to say.
Well, so it happened. It was something that I think when the movie came out, I'm trying to remember when, or if it was in the book, but there was I think it was some interview with Jim Lovell, and I think he said that his wife did actually do that, or Ron Howard had to defend it and be like, no, we put this shot in there because it did happen. Felt weird. I was watching for it this time because I had just kind of recently found that out, because they were going from like flight training, and then she did that, and then they were like getting in the module or so. I don't know. It was a weird place to put it, but it made some more sense knowing that. But I could understand how that could be kind of a weird pacing thing too. So, but other than that, I mean, every other shot, it felt like, even in that slower section, it was intentional, completely intentional. Everything led to something. There was never a moment of, why was that in there? That didn't have to do with anything. Like, you set up the characters with their fun quips and the stupid things they're doing, and showing how Kevin Bacon is a player, and showing how Jim is, everything is addressed. And it's great.
Her dropping the ring in the shower, the showing the audience and giving them the opportunity to realize the potential regret that she was going to feel from her potential loss. My God, that hit me hard this time.
Did it?
It so did. Because if I remember correctly, as far as the timing, again, there's so much that happens in the movie, it's hard to remember the exact pacing. But her decision to not go to the launch, to not go to the launch, then she loses the ring. And if he ended up dying, imagine how much she would be kicking herself for all of that. I could have seen him one more time, and I could have had the thing to hold on to him and have that memory for the rest of my life, and I lost it. All of those things said in is just one more thing of how tragic this could have been for her and her children too. His children and his wife.
True.
So yeah, that scene hit me particularly hard this
That's
time.
good.
It really
good.
did.
Yeah.
It's you're absolutely right. It's completely out of place because it doesn't really fit.
The place that they put it in was a little odd.
Totally.
But I'm with you. It could go both ways. I totally see its drama, but I could also see how people are like, oh, that felt cheap.
Yeah, I think the people that are saying that it completely doesn't fit and it was a cheap gag to get the audience's reaction, I think that's absurd. But yeah, it was strange. There was no setup or anything for it.
Yeah, it just was a random interjection shot.
Totally.
But, and for anyone wondering, she did get her ring back in real life.
Oh, no kidding.
That was, yes.
That's great.
So, I don't know if it was at a hotel, but I don't know, because she was at some random hotel.
That's right.
So yeah, I literally, those are the only two things I could remotely pick apart in this movie.
That was the ring.
It was just the kind of weird, different feel of the first quarter of the movie to the the rest of it.
Yeah.
And the ring scene just being a little out of place. Those would be literally the only two things I could shake a stick at. Other than that, this is a great movie. I can't fault it. I'm sorry. This was childhood and much more.
Let me shake a smaller stick even.
I'll
find my smaller nitpicks. Because yeah, I agree. It was weird pacing at the beginning. To me, I think that it was to its benefit. For whatever reason, it just worked for me. I felt like the strangeness of some of the shots almost was on purpose. To me, it also just shows, for us as filmmakers, yeah, if there's a little shadow, if there's something, as long as you're focusing so heavily on the story and the characters, that's what actually matters. The technical, we did a little screw up or there's a tiny bump in a camera or something, who cares?
I'll give them a break. They were shooting on film, so they didn't know until later.
That's a lot harder, yeah. So yeah, as far as my two little niggles, because yeah, that's basically all I can figure out, two little nitpicks. The first one is that impossible camera move of it going right into the thrusters. That's an artistic decision. That gets a pass. It's whatever. It's just because I try to keep that in mind. So from a cinematography standpoint.
Just based on the genre?
Yeah, that's it. The only other one, and it's something that it's a side effect of doing something so practically. And what they did so practically was the 0G plane shots. And it was the very simple fact that you can't get perfect 0G. There was sometimes, specifically with the taped on urine bag, where it gets separated from the wall. The tape loses its, stickiness and it just separates. And instead of just falling at a constant speed, it accelerates. And that happens in almost every single 0G scene. And I get that you can't get around it, so it totally gets a pass. But it did, I saw that in every single scene. Just the understanding that if something leaves and it didn't have a force acted on it, or it's bouncing around or whatever, eventually it's going to become perfectly still. And without a push on it, it cannot move. Like there were times where like the astronauts would hit their head on something where they were still, and all of a sudden it just went bonk.
Yeah.
It was like, that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But it gets 100% pass because they did it for real. So it's an absolute nitpick, and that's it.
We're grasping at straws, guys.
We are. Yeah, this movie seriously is that good that we're grasping at, hey, they did it for real, but
Not real enough.
they didn't go
They
to actual
screwed up.
space, man. They didn't film in the ISS. Yeah, right.
Fair enough. Okay,
Uh,
so let's go for good things then, because I think we've got an overabundance of those.
Yeah.
Where do you want to start?
Well, I think I don't know. It's just on my brain. We talked a little bit about how this kind of set the path, or at least the set the footing for
Pivotal moment.
for modern space movies, whether they're based on real stories like this one or otherwise. I wouldn't mind talking about the space movies that have come out that we maybe saw in theaters and how they compare to Apollo 11. And what was that?
13.
Yeah, you're right. Apollo 13, yeah. I want to start with my favorite movie of all time, which is Interstellar. I've officially decided that's the favorite one. I just keep coming back to it. It makes me happy, all the different things. And I feel like I learn something different in multiple sectors of life every time I come back to it. As far as realism goes, I think that this follows in Apollo 13's footsteps. I really think Interstellar does. The whole concept of Interstellar was to make it science-based, that all the visuals had to make sense, that it had to be, why is this button this shape? Well, that's because it's easy to press with the gloves. Exactly the stuff that NASA actually did when they were designing everything. So I think that Interstellar does a good job of following in, Apollo 13's footsteps in that way. I think the story's totally different. It's completely fictional in Interstellar, whereas this is a real story that actually happened. But I would say that Interstellar did a really good job. Any thoughts with that movie or any other space movies you want to talk about?
Yeah. So no, that's a good example. I love Interstellar. We'll have to watch it at some point. With love transcending all space and time.
Yes.
Yes, I agree. I think that Apollo 13 came out kind of at a pivotal time for when people were craving some semblance of realism in their movies. That you kind of spoke about it a little bit before, was that Star Wars had kind of been the big space thing right now, and you had ones that were sort of like 2001: A Space Odyssey, if you could stomach your way through it. It's a great movie, but boy, is it long and weird. But you didn't have anything that was more than just science fiction. And we had so much good fodder from the space race that it was, right for the picking. So yeah, in that way, I think that that's kind of why it started it off, is that you see a lot of really good blends of like quasi-realistic science fiction coming out of that. People crave something with a little more gravity. And so yeah, coming into ones like Interstellar, that's kind of why I brought up The Martian or
Yes.
First Man. Or
Martian's a great one. That's another great example of taking because Martian's one of the...
yeah, it's fully fiction, but it's done really well.
Yes, absolutely. It's one of those where if you didn't know, you might think that it actually happened or something. But yeah, The Martian was done so well. I would consider it in that same kind of category.
Yeah.
Realistic, it's completely fiction, but realistic, well done, follows in the footsteps.
Well, it's done kind of like if you're following some of the source material of some of these, like say, for example, Jurassic Park. If you read the books from Michael Crichton, they're really sciencey, and yet it's not to say it's all crap, but like it's theoretical sciencey, where he's throwing like real concepts at fiction. And so it's this kind of perfect blend of, well, we're not doing Star Wars where we know that explosions don't make noise in space. Like we're not going to the extent of a full-fledged space opera, or to Star Trek, where it's a fully different world, similar vein as Star Wars, but it has a little more to it. We're going more towards reality because we now know that these, they're becoming mainstream, that we know that certain things happen in space, and we can now suspend our disbelief in a different way by engaging in a more dramatic retelling of something. And so then coming more to present day with The Martian, and outside of, I don't like Donald Glover's character in that. We'll get there later. But outside of that, because so much of it is grounded and kind of documentary style. You have like GoPro shots from the inside of his lander. Things that pull you into the scene because you're there, stuck with him. Interstellar has a lot of that too. I mean, a lot of the parts where their capsule is sent into a spin. It's all this handheld stuff. You have Tars, who's a
practical puppet for the most part.
Right, yeah.
You have these things that they seem real. They seem like they can be real. And so they found a way to kind of blend them together. And so where Apollo 13 took it to like, no, this happened. And this pretty much was we'll call it a 90% accurate retelling. I don't know how much was embellished, but I know it's pretty close. It was kind of refined from here on out, where they knew what they needed to do realistically, but what they could then spin off. And so you have even shows like on Apple, For All Mankind, where what happens if the Russians won the space race? It's a fascinating concept.
Tell me about that, yeah.
Seasons 1 through 3 are pretty darn good, and then it's blah. But it takes these things to their conclusions through ways that are real, that make some sense, that are grounded in something that we are familiar with, that isn't just complete hooey. And I think that's something that Apollo 13 did to its credit. Granted, the source material was true and riveting enough in its own.
True.
But knowing that there was a market for dramatic space storytelling outside of just fiction, that people craved something that had stakes, that had, Gravity is another example. I know you don't like that movie quite as much.
Let's talk about that, because we know that we disagree on
Yeah.
this. This would be a good one to talk about relating to Apollo 13.
Sure. Well, I'll say that in terms of the realism presented in Gravity, I think that's part of what worked so much in its favor, was that we were at a time in movies where we had the technology to back up doing this essentially digitally, where they didn't have to go through all the hoops that they did necessarily for Apollo 13. And so they could focus on things like the claustrophobic nature because they could do so digitally. And so you had really just this one central character, very simple premise, spacecraft gets struck by space debris and all hell kind of ensues. And so it had a real undertone because they were using NASA equipment. And,
it was the space shuttle, something that we all knew was real and everything.
And actual suits, and the stakes felt real. And granted, the camera got pretty screwy at times on where it was going and what it was doing. But the tech that we had nowadays could allow for that kind of thing. And so in that way, it kind of was figuring out what Interstellar and some of those went on to kind of perfect, but how to tell a fictional, dramatic, based in some sort of reality story. So
I will
fire away.
absolutely concede that Gravity's technical prowess was great. To me, that's about it. I think going shot for shot, Apollo 13 to Gravity, which I think Gravity came out 2013?
I have no clue.
Close to 20 years after this movie. The
Yeah,
technology,
totally.
like crazy.
20
after
teens somewhere.
iPhone, all that stuff. Let's talk about one scene in particular, because it relates directly to Apollo 13.
Okay.
And that is the nightmare scenes. Nightmare scene for nightmare scene. Which one was more scary?
I'll be completely honest. I don't specifically remember the Gravity one. The Apollo 13 one, I always thought it was interesting that it was coming from the perspective of his wife. So that was cool.
Yeah.
But remind me for the Gravity one, because I don't entirely remember. Was it when she was in the capsule talking to the kid or something, right?
So after everybody dies, George Clooney is gone. She is in the capsule alone, and then all of a sudden, she has no spacesuit on or anything.
Right. She does that fetal position thing.
Yeah. All of a sudden, within the same shot, no cuts, no nothing. So it goes from her real life. She goes in the fetal position like a baby, all that stuff, and then all of a sudden, George Clooney, who's been sucked off into space, just shows up outside, and somehow he opens up the space capsule and starts talking to her, and she's hallucinating, and all these weird things happen. And I remember that pulling me directly out of the movie, and it didn't work. I mean, the fact that she literally goes from these traumatic things happening to taking off her spacesuit, and in the exact same shot, nothing changes. She immediately sees herself in that perspective as a dream, and George Clooney's there, and she's hallucinating about this person that she just lost and all that. When he obviously just got sucked out to space, never to be seen again. It didn't work at all. Seriously, that's a story thing. Whereas the Apollo 13 one completely serves the story. We don't see the wife first. We actually see in Apollo 13, we see Tom Hanks's character right before the nightmare scene happens. We see the nightmare scene, and we think that it's through Tom Hanks's eyes. We see him getting ripped out and everything's going wrong. Glass is shattering in their faces and, gloves are coming off. They're not protected anymore. And you realize all these horrible things happen. And when the waking up happens, we realize it's from his wife. what a story-serving thing. The fact that she's so terrified that makes her decide that she can't go to the launch. She ends up doing it anyway for him. But that it also helps to serve that because that's in the movie, but it's not from Tom Hanks's perspective, we see how fearless he is going to do this. So, nightmare scene for hallucination scene.
Yeah, that's
Gravity
fair.
does nothing.
That's fair. That's fair. Well, and to add to your point for why Apollo 13 works so well too is the way that it cuts where this hallucination scene is positioned. Is it looks like they're now on their mission. They go into, they're all now in helmets and they're doing their things. You're like, oh,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah,
As a
okay,
first
we're
time
there.
viewer, they're in space. They're starting their mission, and then it's a hallucination. So yeah, to that way it works so much better. So yeah, that's fair. And I know that that's kind of. I don't remember his name. He did The Revenant and stuff too. But the director who did Gravity, Alfonso Cuarón, likes to do that kind of a little bit of oddball stuff in movies that tend to be really dense. So that's fair. I can see that.
And
So,
the other one I want to talk
We'll have to hit
about.
Gravity at some point. Then.
Yeah, that'll be a fun one. The other thing I want to talk about with Gravity as it pertains to Apollo 13 is that Apollo 13 had challenge after challenge after challenge after challenge. Just when we think that they have everything set, it's like, okay, they finally figured out the CO2, and that was a crazy scene. And they're working on booting up the computer, and we got the guy in, so we think that that's going to be okay. And we're like, okay, the audience can finally breathe. And we're like,
Master Alarm.
well, sir, there's going to be a typhoon
Yeah.
warning where they're going to
You're
be
like,
landing.
"Ah."
Are you kidding me? There's going to be a typhoon where they just made it through space, man. Give them a break. And like, that's like crazy. That ends up being a contingency plan and ends up being fine and everything. But that was like, are you kidding me? You're sitting in your seat thinking that, or like all that. Contrast that to the problem after problem after problem after problem in Gravity. It all feels so contrived, and how the hell did one person do all this by herself and survive? The tipping point for me was the space shuttle gets absolutely destroyed. Somehow she makes it, if I remember correctly, again, haven't seen it in a long time, she somehow makes it all the way to the ISS, which the fact it was, it might have been on there. Either way, she makes it back to the ISS. Then she has to get into a Russian capsule.
Into the Soyuz, yeah.
And somehow she just knows Russian and everything, which that actually can be fine. Astronauts are very smart people. But she gets in there, has her hallucinations or whatever, and then figures out how to deploy it, even though she's not trained on using a Russian thing, with no support. I think it was actually George Clooney's hallucination that helps her. Dumb. Anyway, all of this stuff happens, and she makes it through, and she has to get all these different things to work out. And then she lands, and everything's good. And now she's drowning. Now the capsule's sinking. That had a problem too. Oh no. And then she's wearing the heavy suit and getting bogged down after she gets out. And now she's drowning again. And it's just like, it really, really felt like the director of Gravity saw Apollo 13 and thought, wow, they had a lot of things happen. It was crazy. They even had the typhoon and stuff. I'm going to do that too. And it did nothing. So I really don't like Gravity because I feel like there were a lot of things that were ripped from Apollo 13, a much better movie based off of a true story, thrown in there. And especially because Gravity is all about one person doing it all by themselves, you miss the entire point, which is that if you are ripping off Apollo 13, Apollo 13 was all about the hundreds and hundreds of people that are backing up this team in space. So if they are ripping it off, they completely miss the point and what it actually meant. There's
Catch
my
us
soapbox.
next week when Matthew rips Gravity a new one.
I will do the review on that by myself, just like Sandra Bullock did the entire movie by herself.
I'm gonna go to snack.
I wanted to talk about Gravity. if you could tell.
Well, we'll talk about that later. I have a counter argument to that, but that's okay. That's a different episode. So, but in terms of other things that Apollo 13 does really well, we had touched on it. Let's touch on it now for VFX. I think that for being a movie that's, decades old at this point,
Sorry, before we move on. Basically, we were talking about how Apollo 13 kind of set the standard for realism in space movies. And there are different ways that people have approached it, some better than others, is basically what we were getting at. Now moving on to the CGI.
Yeah, so to the VFX. I think that when pulling together the team to produce this movie, to to bring it to life, knowing that, of course, it was kind of in that classic 90s realm of, well, CG is available, but it sucks, or it's passable. And so how are we going to pull off this hyper-realistic space movie? And it just speaks to how intelligently they did it. And when you look at kind of the crew of people who did it, it speaks volumes. Like I had mentioned, their VFX director was the same one that did Star Trek, that I think he was doing Next Generation at this point. And so when I was looking for that on this watch, all the planets and the passing by of spacecraft looked just like the Enterprise passing by a planet, done practically, motion control rigs. And so they're pulling things from the earlier days of like Star Wars, where that was the only way to do it, was miniatures and motion control rigs, and then perfectly blending it with things that they can only do in CG. So for example, the rocket taking off, completely miniature motion control, but because they're in Florida and the rocket tank is cooling down the moisture in the air that's taking off and all the ice chips are falling off, completely CG. And it's something that's so minimal and a garnish on the rest of this that it works, and it works well.
Yes.
The smoke coming out of the bottom is just a miniature. It's amazing. And so they know in that era, because they don't have an endless budget to throw at it, and because the tech doesn't really exist to throw CG at it like you could with a Marvel movie nowadays, you get so much better of a compromise between intentionality and quality, and where you have to put your effort to make something look believable and good. And you have so many people working on a movie like this that have been masters of the industry and working through this particular decade, where you've got people like in other movies, I guess, like Stan Winston, people who are masters of the craft of practical, working within this movie under the direction of someone who has only ever been in movies that are practical up until now, and things like that. It's great. And this movie is a perfect example of it all, and how they used it to their advantage to make a movie that lasts decades, that's relevant decades later.
100%. You know, you got me thinking about the spaceship and all those movements and everything. And there was a shot that I noticed only because we watch VFX Artist Reacts. We both do.
Yep.
And
Shout out to Corridor Crew.
yes, there's a shot where Tom Hanks's character is going for a flight. He's in some sort of plane. I don't know which one it is, but it's that gray plane, you know? And we see him flying, and it's in blue sky. And the shot basically goes, and we find these trees, and it pans down, and there's his wife watching him fly away. I think that might have been another motion control rig. I think that might have been a miniature. I don't know if you remember that scene.
I remember the shot. I don't remember it. It looked real to me, but I don't know.
It looked so good. But there was one point where the focus on the plane and then the leaves that were pretty close right when they entered the shot, both were in focus, and that felt off to me. It felt like that was too far away from this. You know, it'd basically be me looking right at this light, and the plane is way the heck up there, and both were in focus. That's the only thing that tipped me off to it might be CGI, it might be a motion control rig, and the fact it also happened to line up perfectly within the two banks of trees. But if it is VFX, it's another perfect example of use it where it's necessary and use it
It could have just
gently.
been a comp shot too. If they needed a shot of a plane, they just comped it in.
It might have been. The perspective was freaking fantastic. You know?
I'd have to look again. That didn't pull me out at all. So
I
interesting.
wouldn't mind a breakdown on this actually from Corridor Crew because
So did you watch the episode with the
Was there
VFX
one?
with the VFX supervisor?
no kidding.
Because then
I'll
he
have to
went
rewatch
on.
that.
This was one of his first movies. Not his first. He did I think Interview with a Vampire before this one, but this was his major like blockbuster. And right after this, he got Titanic, and then he got even ones more recently like The Lion King, the remake. Jungle Book. He's done a ton. If you look at his catalog, he's done like every major motion picture that we would hold near and dear for VFX. And it's insane. And has this kind of brash personality where it's kind of a screw around and find out situation. Where on this one, I mean, he talks in particular about the shot of the rocket, where it's the classic like telephoto shot of, well, the rocket's here and it's, you know, camera shaking and you see the propulsion trail behind it. It's kind of a nice frame shot.
Yeah.
And he said it's just literally a Saturn V miniature that he got at like a hardware store. He was standing across the room with like a 400 millimeter lens, just like doing this. And then they filmed practically the trails. They did some of it with CG, and then they filmed not CTV, basically a screen, because when you're exposed, CG at that time didn't have kind of the HDR qualities that you expect. And so it's way dimmer than the rest of it, makes it look animated. And so they filmed it practically on a TV with like a Pro Mist filter on top of it to expose it down to bring some of the detail back. And then they basically overexposed by a few stops the shot of that and then comped them together.
Nice.
And so stuff like that, where he's just like, I don't know how we're gonna do this, let's just try this. And he made a career off of it. And clearly it stuck because then he
Yes.
went on to do, massive movies.
Well, speaking about that particular shot as well, that one actually stuck out to me, that wide angle of it going through the atmosphere on takeoff. Man, that stuck out to me as probably the best shot I've ever seen of something leaving the atmosphere, showing speed. All the other things I've ever seen leaving the atmosphere, yeah, they kind of look fast, but it's like kind of playing fast or whatever, not like out of this world fast. And this, even though he's just shaking a freaking camera at a model or whatever, oh my gosh, it looked like they were blazing through the heavens. It really did. So credit to him.
Just smart decisions. Just a lot of smart decisions.
Yeah. So,
Understanding the photographic process as well as just some of the science. Watching a lot of reference material.
yes.
It just speaks volumes about, well, you can't just CG everything and expect it to work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that the CGI was incredible in this movie. The VFX.
The lack of CGI was incredible in this movie.
The VFX is a better term. Were absolutely stunning. Completely hold up. There wasn't even like a jank shot that stuck out.
Yeah,
it's
nothing
like
that ever broke away. You got the classic shot of the separation, and he said that's just a matched up shot. It's just a front plate and a back plate, and then the Earth is a stock photo from NASA.
yeah.
And he did his classic kind of what we all do when we put a 2D image in 3D and you give it a little bit of that swirl. And he pulled some of his Star Trek stops where he projected it onto a circle, onto some sort of a spherical object that he turned, and then rear projected it to give that halation along the side. So like amazing, practical,
Simple,
phenomenal.
easy.
And then using motion control rigs to your advantage to work the miniatures in a good way. It's just so cool, man.
It really
it's so
is.
cool. What ingenuity for making movies at that time, between the film, like actual film trickery and understanding chemical science, but also working with models, understanding miniatures, understanding what you can do because you have to do it practically. And in his case, making a career out of not having a clue what he was doing, just solving problems.
Yeah.
What a cool way to live.
Absolutely. Well, just before we move on to scores, I did want to ask you something new that I've been thinking about doing for this.
Okay.
What is your favorite frame and what is your least favorite frame of the whole movie?
Like if I were taking a screen grab frame or like just scene or...
Yeah, just a screen grab. Yeah, like
I would take
yeah,
a
if you
screen
had
grab.
to take one frame from the entire movie that like stuck out to you is most memorable, has the most emotional connection, whatever, that just sticks out to you as like, yeah, that was a sick moment. That was freaking awesome. And on the contrast, that was bad.
That's fair. That's fair. I think my favorite, it has a little motion, but it's essentially a frame, is at the end of the movie when they're confirmed to be coming down for touchdown, and everybody in mission control is clapping, and it's Gary Sinise standing there, and the camera cranes down on him as all of this stuff is going on, and he's just kind of in a state of shock.
Yep.
I like that. That's a good frame.
Yep.
I'll go
That's
with
a
that
really
as the good
frame.
one. The bad one is, I commented on it when we were watching it, was when Tom Hanks was driving, and it showed him from the outside weaving into his lane with like 4 very strategically placed cars around him that were on an empty road, just them, and the car behind him was like up his butt the whole time. And it had the classic, like, well, this is obviously a car shot lighting where they had bright lights, going up their nose. I didn't like that one very much. That pulled me right out of there.
For sure.
So
Perfect.
How about you? What you got?
My favorite frame, typically I would say that it would be when they are going backwards in the capsule when they're landing and all the water's falling down on them.
That's yeah.
Goodness, that's amazing. But the one that stuck out this watching was actually when they first shut the computer down. Basically, we had seen all these buttons light up. We knew that there's electricity flowing through and everything's alive. And then when they actually shut it down and it's just lit by the sun peeking through the window on these blank, lifeless controls, that's my frame this time.
Okay.
That just stuck out as a huge, like, wow, what a use of just easy lighting to tell, like, what this means to everybody. As far as bad frames, it might be that same car scene, honestly.
Such a weird scene.
It is. I get why it had to be there.
Yeah. It's just weirdly filmed.
Yeah, probably that car scene. It's fine because of what they have to tell, and like I get the little kick because of knowing all the stuff about the Coke body Corvettes back then that the astronauts basically got them for free, and they were the rock stars of the time. That's how he got recognized in the car.
Hey, you're Jim Lovell.
Yeah, like all that stuff made sense, but I'd probably agree. That's probably my least
Just a
favorite frame.
weird shot.
Yeah.
Cool.
Ready to go into scores?
Yes.
Perfect. So in every single episode, we basically go and we give scores to 6 different categories. We add up Daniel's total, we add up my total, divide it by 2, and get a total score out of 5 that we then post on Letterboxd. And you can follow us on Letterboxd at OTW Video. So
Excellent.
we're going to cut right now, get our scores, and we'll be back with...
Well, we haven't talked about any of them yet.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
So we want to talk about them and then we'll do scores?
Well, let's...
We can do it briefly.
Yeah.
So, uniqueness. What you got?
Yeah, uniqueness for this... It's the most unique you can possibly get. It's a real story. It's a real freaking story that never happened before, cannot happen after this in the same way that it did. Uniqueness is... Yes. It's
Fair.
the most unique something could possibly be.
Fair. I'm with you. It's difficult to judge movies that are older that set the standard, but I agree completely. If you just step back and look at the story, the fact that it was a true story and told the way it was, told with some level of accuracy, yeah, it's as unique as it can get. So, how about cinematography?
Cinematography, excellent. We already talked about the VFX in particular and how there's basically only one scene that has a bad frame. That's the only one both of us can think about. Cinematography has to be really, really good. Not even just for its time. Just spectacular cinematography.
Fair enough. I think it was story-serving cinematography. So, yeah, I wouldn't say it was the most interesting cinematography ever at all times, especially that beginning quarter chunk. I was paying attention to it a lot this time. And it was, fairly bland then. But I mean, it's a classic cinematographer who's defined the way we've seen a lot of the movies that we've grown up on. So in that way, it reeked of the Dean Cundy style. So I'm all for it. So it was good cinematography. So how about story?
Yeah, story. Just like how it's so unique, I think the story was so good. We already mentioned it was crazy unique, and that there were a lot of characters that had to be juggled, and how all of them worked so perfectly. The story is absolutely insane. Yeah, it's a spectacular story.
Absolutely. Not only super unique, but we've seen a lot of real life stories be completely just mistold, and this is one that's told well. It's an inspiring story. Doesn't have to be overly embellished. The story alone is strong. So,
Absolutely.
Okay. Execution.
Execution, extremely high marks. This is going to be very repetitive, I can tell. Execution is top notch. I mean, we mentioned that you can see the shadows if you look really closely, that the car scene was just kind of meh. It was cool that it was in there and everything, gave characters, a little bit more depth. But yeah, execution was top notch.
Yeah.
Top marks.
It's at the standard. Agreed. Immersion.
I was pulled in the entire time. Did not have to look at my Omega watch. I don't have an Omega, but you know what I mean. Yeah, I wasn't pulled away at all for a single moment. It was that immersive.
Yeah, agreed completely. Every time Apollo 13 has ever been on the TV playing, like if you go to a hotel or something, I always watch it through. I'm always pulled in. I love this movie. So yeah, emotional connection.
Huge. I think a good telltale sign, even if it's not like emotionally connected to your personal life, but if you feel like crying multiple times, or you feel like the characters who are actors in a safe space are going to die, then they did a great job of creating emotional connection. So for me, super high.
Absolutely.
Great emotional connection in this movie.
Absolutely. I think that because there were so many characters, I'll give them a little bit of a pass on the fact that I think that the two non Tom Hanks characters in the capsule, especially whose name we had established.
Fredo.
Fredo. I almost said Franco. Fredo. Could have been a little more fleshed out in terms of why he was there and what he was doing. But beyond that, I think everyone else got the screen time they needed, that they didn't really need to be fleshed out more necessarily. And you get the little wrap up at the end, as you do with a lot of true story telling. So emotionally, you know, I was invested in the people that were there. And then I will have to say, on a tangent, this is one of my all-time favorite musical scores. And I am always brought to tears when I hear it because, you know, James Horner is no longer with us. And this is just, it's a score that holds a lot of emotion for me in general, and that without the musical score that this movie has, this movie would be a very different movie.
It would.
And
That
so,
solo trumpet.
exactly. So just the amazingness that James Horner brings to this. I know he's my sister-in-law's favorite composer. This is easily one of my favorite scores of his. And it's they don't make movies or scores like that anymore. So emotional connection gets higher marks for James Horner, I would say, than even the actors in this one. So, okay, scores.
Yeah, let's get into scores. We'll be right back.
All right, we are back with our final tallies for you. So, going down the list, uniqueness.
Uniqueness, I gave it a 5.
I also did.
I mean, seriously, there's not really much more unique than
It's a true
this.
story, and it's a good true story.
It's fantastic.
Cinematography.
Cinematography, 4.7. Incredibly good, but we did mention that there were a couple technical flaws. Like you saw some shadows, the car scene, the staging of the cars. That's the staging. That's not really cinematography, but the cinematographer should notice things like that. They were so few and far between that it gets crazy high marks. But because we've said if it wasn't perfect, we can't give it a full 5. So 4.7.
I'm kind of in the same boat there. I gave it a 4.5. Not the best I've ever seen for Dean Cundey, but the shots that were inspired were very inspired, and then it felt like some of it, especially at the beginning, kind of fell by the wayside. So I will, same kind of thing. Like that car scene just is tricky. Story.
Story, 5.
Also 5.
Next is execution.
I gave it a 5. I think it's about the best way you could tell the story.
I fully agree. The fact that it is compared to documentaries like we did right at the beginning of this, yet it is not, and it's just incredibly entertaining. The execution, no disrespect to any of the characters, no nothing. Nobody took a fall. Execution has to be a 5. It's
Absolutely.
that good.
Immersion.
Immersion, a 5.
Also a 5. Yeah.
Even with
Just have to sit down and watch this movie every time.
You have to. The fact too, like the weird scene of her having to lose her ring, I was immersed like crazy in that. And maybe it's because I'm watching in a different time where I'm recently, engaged in everything that matters more now. But it made sense and it pulled me in even more. So yeah, 5s on immersion.
Fair enough. Emotional connection.
Emotional connection 5.
give it a 5?
Just straight up. Yeah, it's so good and it moves me every single time.
Gotcha. I gave it actually a lower score than I thought I would. I gave it a 4. I spoke very fondly of James Horner, and that's all well and good. But because this movie has to balance all of the technical things and the understanding of the audience of technical things with the actual emotional turmoil that's going through, I kind of base it off the fact that I don't know the names of most of these people at the end of the day. And there are certain characters that are important. Yeah, that are important and are fleshed out, and they're resolved and everything like that. But I would love to see a little more from a few. Certainly, I'd love to see a little bit more, especially from those in the capsule, even if it's them interacting with each other. But understanding that it's also true story, and that for the most part, that was probably the reason why it wasn't taken to that side. So you have these nice endearing moments like Tom Hanks's discussion with his son. Talking about the door that didn't open, and we get that flashback at the beginning of the movie. We get the gravity that comes with a flame out in the cockpit of that first Apollo mission. And so moments like that could be maybe fleshed out a little bit more for some of the other characters, but that's subjective for sure. So cool. 4.75 was my average.
And mine was a 4.95. I think you can see where this is going. So, Apollo 13, we have given you some notes. And your final score out of 5 is 4.85. That easily rounds up to a
5-star?
5 out of 5 stars.
Amazing.
When I said that this is something that I wish I could watch for the first time, that's what I mean by that. Once you see a movie that has that emotional connection, that moves you the way that it does and is executed so well, you want to see it again for the first time with fresh eyes. That's what a 5 out of 5 should be, and that's exactly what this movie is.
It's a movie that even with the desire to see it fresh, it still is just as engaging, just as refreshing in a lot of ways, just as powerful with every subsequent watch. Where you maybe aren't necessarily rewarded consistently with like new things to see, but it feels like you just build up even more of an appreciation for just a good story well told.
Absolutely.
And at the end of the day, that's everything in this business. So a good story well told.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for watching this episode of the We Have Notes podcast. We do this every Friday, and let us know what movies you would like us to watch. We're going into Oscar season here pretty soon.
We're gonna have to start cranking up our best picture list.
Yes.
We have a few in mind, but if you have ideas, leave some comments, please. Throw us a like, throw us a subscription, and we're just gonna keep on doing this. So
Yeah.
catch us next week.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for watching, and good night.
Good night.